a mother shattered by grief, a soldier haunted by ghosts, and a tiny puppy caught between life and death. None of them knew their fates were about to collide. When flames swallowed her home and the forest echoed with her screams, one man ran toward the fire, guided not by duty, but by something greater. What happened next wasn't chance. It was a miracle, born from loss, stitched by courage, and delivered through the paws of a dog who refused to give up. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Snow drifted quietly across the narrow harbor lane, softening the sounds of a town that had long ago grown used to silence. Havenport was always quiet in winter, but this quiet felt different, closer to a held breath than a season. Ethan Cole walked through it without hurry, his steps deliberate, neither searching for anything nor fleeing from what trailed behind him. The cold did not bother him. What weighed on him was the echoing space inside his own chest, the one that had once been filled by voices, commands, the certainty of danger, and the loyalty of a creature that no longer walked beside him. Ethan had come to Havenport because it was the type of place that asked nothing of anyone. After years in the Navy, after the desert and the cave collapse, and the unbearable stillness that followed Ranger's final breath, Ethan no longer knew how to live among people who smiled easily. Here, on this forgotten edge of the coast, he could pretend quiet was a choice. Some days he even believed it. But on mornings like this, when the sky felt too empty and the air too still, he sensed the truth. He had not chosen silence. It had chosen him, pinned him, and left him to figure out how to breathe inside it. He tightened his gloves as he continued down the lane, past shuttered shops and windows blurred by frost. The world looked soft from the outside, but Ethan had learned too often that softness could be a mask for what waited beneath. It was that instinct, more than the cold, that caused him to pause when he heard a sound cut sharply through the snow-muted quiet. A cry, thin, high, and trembling. Not the wind, not a child, something more fragile. Ethan turned his head, scanning the alley between two old buildings, the abandoned bait shop and the old storage shed that locals no longer bothered locking. The sound came again, this time entwined with a ragged voice, a voice strained to the edge of breaking. "Give him back to me." Ethan felt something in him shift, a recognition of despair so raw it bypassed thought. He stepped toward the alley. The farther he went, the clearer the scene became, painted in strokes of panic and winter light. A woman stood hunched in the snow, her hair wild, her breath coming in frantic bursts. It was as if she didn't fully inhabit her own body, as if she were moving on instinct alone, an instinct sharpened by trauma. The townspeople whispered about her. Lily Breen, a mother once, a mother who had lost everything in the span of a few terrible minutes by the lake last summer. Ethan had never met her, but he'd heard fragments of her story. The child who slipped from her hands, the water that closed too fast, the scream that never left her chest. Now she hovered over something small pressed into the snow. A puppy. A German shepherd pup so young and so slight it seemed more like a trembling shadow than a living creature. It tried to push itself backward, its paws scrambling, but the woman stomped forward, heel crashing down beside it. "Give him back! You took him! You took my boy!" Her voice cracked at the edges, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, grief that had curdled into delusion. Ethan did not know her history in detail, but he didn't need to. He knew the look of a mind pushed past what it could carry. He'd seen men break that way in war. He'd felt the beginnings of it clawing through his own ribs on nights he wished he hadn't survived. He stepped forward. "Ma'am," he called gently, though something stern underlined the word. "Step away." She didn't hear him, or couldn't. Her world had collapsed into a single frantic loop, the child she'd lost and the ghost she chased. The puppy whimpered again, and she lifted her foot, rage and sorrow twisting her into something unrecognizable, even to herself. Ethan moved without further warning. His body shifted into the same controlled urgency he once used breaching doors in hostile compounds. 1 second he was at the alley's mouth. The next he was beside her, hand gripping her wrist, not tight enough to hurt, only enough to stop the downward motion of her heel. "Stop," he said, softly, but with the weight of a command forged over years. "You're hurting him." Her head snapped toward him. Her eyes were wide and empty, as if the person she used to be was standing miles away behind them. "They took him," she whispered, voice breaking. "They took my son. The dogs, the water, the sound." She clutched her hair, trembling. "They took him." Ethan didn't loosen his grip until her foot dropped harmlessly back to the snow. She yanked her arm away, stumbled backward, and stared at the puppy as if seeing it through a warped memory. Then something inside her cracked without sound. She turned and fled, running not toward safety, but simply away from the unbearable weight of herself. Her footsteps vanished into the trees beyond Havenport, swallowed by the forest and whatever ghosts waited there. Ethan watched her go only long enough to ensure she didn't collapse. Then he knelt. The puppy lay trembling, sides rising too quickly, breath cloudy against the cold. It wasn't the creature's size that struck Ethan. It was the quiet fight in its body, the refusal to quit, even when the world closed in around it. Something in that reminded him painfully of Ranger, of the dog who refused to leave him trapped beneath fractured rock until the last moment he drew breath. "You're safe now," Ethan murmured, though he wasn't certain who he was trying to reassure. He lifted the pup. It weighed almost nothing, like a handful of warmth trying not to flicker out. The pup pressed weakly against his chest, not in fear, but in surrender to the first safety it had likely known. Ethan wrapped it inside his coat and rose. Snow continued falling, blanketing the alley, covering the footprints of the woman who had run into the trees. Ethan stood a moment longer, feeling a shift inside him he hadn't expected. He had arrived in Havenport to disappear, to sever his ties to the world. Yet here was the world placing something fragile into his hands again, a life small enough to lose, important enough not to. He turned toward his cabin by the cliffs, the weight in his coat barely more than a breath. He did not know that this morning would mark the beginning of something larger than fear or memory. He only knew that the puppy's heartbeat was faint, and he had no intention of letting it fade. Snow thickened around the cliffside cabin as night settled, turning the world into a muted sphere of white where even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Ethan Cole closed the cabin door behind him and felt the shift of air inside the small room, a space that had once been merely shelter but now contained something unexpectedly fragile curled against his chest. The puppy he had taken from the snow barely moved as he carried it toward the dim glow of the stove. Its breaths fluttered weakly, and Ethan sensed how close it had been to the edge. He lowered himself to the floor beside the stove and placed the pup on a folded blanket. It gave only the faintest shift of its body, more a reflex than a movement of intention, yet Ethan knew it was still fighting. That unspoken fight struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years on battlefields watching men and animals draw their last breaths in the dirt and dust, but it was the small, stubborn breaths that haunted him most, the ones that refused to surrender even when the world around them had collapsed. The cabin creaked from a gust of wind, and Ethan felt that familiar pressure push against the back of his mind, the one that came whenever silence settled too deeply. He tried to ignore it as he warmed water on the stove and searched the shelf for the small packet of powdered milk he saved for emergencies. When he dipped the cloth and brought it to the puppy's mouth, it twitched as if deciding whether the world was worth answering. Then the tongue moved, barely brushing the damp fabric. Ethan held the cloth steady. "That's it," he murmured. His voice surprised him. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to anything so gently. The pup took a second drop, then a third. Something in the steady focus of its effort pulled Ethan backward into a place he had avoided for months. Ranger. His chest tightened before the memory even fully formed. There had been no snow in Helmand Province, only heat rising from rock and dust, shaking under distant artillery. Ranger had been more than his partner. The dog was a force contained in muscle and instinct, but also in something Ethan never successfully named, a loyalty so absolute it had felt like standing beside a living promise. Ranger had saved him more times than he could count, pulling him from hidden explosives, warning him of ambushes, pressing his weight against Ethan's ribs during the nights when sleep was a battlefield of its own. But the last mission had stripped all those nights away. Ethan did not want to relive it, but the memories cracked open regardless. The cave, the collapse, the radio static, the desperate scratching of paws near his shoulder as dust filled the air. Ranger pushing him toward the light while the ground split beneath them. The final sound, a soft whine swallowed by crumbling stone, as Ranger vanished into the dark. Ethan inhaled sharply, forcing his thoughts back into the present. The room was warm, the air tasted of smoke and faint salt. And the creature beside him was alive, trembling, but alive. He couldn't change the past, but he could keep this pup from becoming another ghost. Hours passed in near silence, except for the stove and the steady rhythm of Ethan's breath as he fed, rubbed, and warmed the fragile body. The puppy occasionally opened its eyes, though only halfway, as if measuring the world piece by piece. Each glance seemed to ask a question. Am I safe? Ethan answered it with every motion. Not words, not promises, but the kind of presence he once offered to men bleeding out in the dirt, the kind of presence Ranger had once given him. Outside, the wind shifted direction, beating against the window like a knuckle, demanding attention. Ethan ignored it until he heard something else, a faint crunch beyond the door, something moving across the snow. His hand instinctively reached for the flashlight. Old habits of danger rose quickly in him, but when he opened the door, he found only Martha Green standing on the porch, bundled awkwardly against the cold. Martha was not fragile, but grief had softened her edges over the years. She had lost her husband to the sea decades earlier, and people said the loss had made her quieter, more perceptive to the hurts of others. She held a thermos between her hands. "Thought you might need this," she said. "You left town in a hurry earlier. Folks said it looked serious." Ethan stepped aside and let her enter. She didn't approach the pup immediately. Instead, she stood over the stove and warmed her hands while studying Ethan. "You look like someone who hasn't breathed properly in a long time." He gave a small shrug. "It's just a dog." Martha looked at him for a long moment. Nothing alive is ever just anything. When she finally knelt beside the pup, her voice lowered. "He's small," she said softly, "but strong. You can feel it." Ethan hadn't expected her to sense that same stubborn spark he felt, but maybe she had learned how to recognize life fighting to stay alive. After all, Martha herself had survived years of loneliness in a house by the pier, listening to the sea steal voices it never returned. She placed a hand lightly on the pup's side. "He trusts you already." Ethan looked away. Trust was a word that pressed too hard against the cracks in his chest. Instead, he poured tea into a cup, letting its warmth anchor him. Martha stayed only a short while, but before leaving she said, "Take care of him. Not because he needs it, but because you do." When the door shut behind her, Ethan returned to the blanket and lifted the puppy. Its heartbeat beat steadily now, no longer racing from fear, but settling into a rhythm that matched the quiet of the cabin. He felt strangely unwilling to let go. "Your Ember," he said quietly. The name surfaced without thought, a word that felt like the beginning of something small but persistent, the last glow in a fire that refused to die. Ember stirred slightly as if acknowledging the name, then relaxed again. Ethan settled him back onto the blanket, but even as he did, he felt a shift in the air. Subtle, uneasy. Not from Ember, but from something waiting outside the edge of the cliff, beyond the trees, beyond the quiet snow. Something he could not yet name. He sensed only that the morning wait for answers would bring more than he expected, and that Lily Breen, somewhere out in the dark, was not finished walking the fractured line between grief and danger. Something was coming, and Ember's survival tonight felt like the first ripple of a much larger storm. Fog drifted lazily between the trees that bordered Havenport, clinging to branches like breath that had nowhere else to go. Morning light filtered through in muted fragments, soft enough to make the forest seem harmless, though Ethan Cole knew better than to trust anything that hid its edges. He paused on the narrow path leading from his cabin toward town, Ember tucked securely in the crook of his arm, his warmth faint but steady. The pup had taken food twice during the night and slept in restless bursts, sometimes whimpering, sometimes twitching, as if wrestling dreams too heavy for a creature so small. Ethan recognized the signs. The body remembers danger long after it ends. That, perhaps more than anything, was why he wanted the vet to see Ember as quickly as possible. As he approached the tree line, a sound clicked faintly behind him. His instincts sharpened instantly, old training flaring awake like sparks in dry grass. But when he turned, the only thing he saw was a figure approaching down the snowy trail, hands tucked in pockets, shoulders squared against the cold. Deputy Alan Pierce. Ethan had seen him around Havenport a handful of times, always composed, always watchful. The kind of man who carried the weight of his badge without letting it crush him. He had the air of someone shaped not by power, but by responsibility, a distinction Ethan respected. Alan stopped a few paces away. His gaze lowered to Ember, then lifted to Ethan with an expression hovering somewhere between concern and apology. "Morning," he said, his breath showing in pale clouds. "I heard what happened yesterday." Ethan stiffened slightly. Word traveled fast in small towns, faster still when it involved someone already whispered about, like Lily Breen. "Is she all right?" Ethan asked, though what he really meant was, did she survive the night alone? Is she still lost inside whatever world swallowed her? Alan nodded slowly. "Physically? Yes. Emotionally? That's harder to say." He hesitated before continuing, as if choosing the order of his words mattered. "Ethan, I think you deserve to know what you walked into." Ethan adjusted Ember in his arms. The puppy stirred weakly. "Tell me." Alan looked toward the forest, where the fog drew a wavering curtain. Lily wasn't always like this. A year ago she was one of the warmest people in Havenport. Quiet, but good-hearted. Worked at the library, took her little boy, Jonah, everywhere. You'd see the two of them at the pier feeding gulls or running across the green near the lighthouse. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. Then came July. Ethan waited, knowing the hardest parts of a story were often the ones spoken slowest. Alan continued. "It was hot that day. Jonah was chasing a neighbor's dog along the edge of the lake. The bank was slick from rain the night before. Lily told him to stop. People heard her shout, but the boy didn't listen. He slipped. The dog turned back and barked, but he exhaled. Lily jumped in after him. She fought like hell, but the water was cold, deeper than she expected. By the time help got there, Jonah was gone." The forest seemed to absorb the silence that followed. Ethan felt the weight settle across his shoulders. He had seen grief-hollow people out before, but something about a mother losing a child carved deeper wounds than any bullet or explosion. Alan's voice softened. "Lily hasn't been the same since. Some days she's lucid, other days she's trapped in that moment." He gestured vaguely in the direction of town. She can't look at dogs without breaking. Her mind twists them into something they never were. She believes the dog took Jonah from her, not the accident. Ember whined softly, sensing tension without understanding it. Ethan lifted a hand to steady him. Yesterday she thought Ember was the dog from the lake, Alan said quietly. Or at least a version of it her mind made up? Ethan's jaw tensed. She tried to kill him. She didn't see Ember, Alan replied gently. She saw a ghost she's been fighting alone for months. Ethan did not respond right away. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with a complicated ache. He knew what ghosts could do when they were allowed to grow unchecked. Ether had lived years with his own, their shadows crawling behind his ribs. Perhaps Lily's were louder, but they were the same species of torment. "Is she dangerous?" Ethan asked. Alan considered the question. Not intentionally, but grief doesn't care about intention. The wind shifted, carrying the distant scent of the ocean. Ember's head nuzzled against Ethan's coat as if anchoring himself. Alan looked at him with a firmness that wasn't unkind. "Ethan, this town is small. People talk. Lily's collapse scares them, but they don't know how to help. She's not evil. She's injured in a way most folks don't understand." He paused, lowering his voice. "You may be the first person she's crossed paths with who knows what carrying a broken memory feels like." Something in Ethan flinched at the accuracy of the statement. Alan took a step closer. "I don't say this lightly. Lily needs help. Real help. And she won't survive long alone in the state she's in. She wanders at night. She forgets to eat. Sometimes she sleeps in the woods." Ethan's pulse shifted beneath his skin. The image rose too clearly, Lily fleeing into the trees the day before, her voice cracking into the frozen air. "She'll hurt herself," Ethan said, "or someone else." "Or she'll freeze," Alan added grimly. "Which is why I came. I need you to understand the whole picture if this becomes more than one incident." Ember shifted, curling closer. Ethan's mind replayed the previous day, the moment he lifted the trembling pup, the wildness in Lily's eyes, the sound of her scream, more grief than fury. A storm had been gathering long before he arrived in Havenport. He had simply stepped into its path. Alan exhaled, pulling his coat tighter. "I'll head into town now. There's talk about finding Lily some structured care, maybe getting a specialist from Portland to evaluate her." He paused before turning down the trail. "You saved that pup, and you kept Lily from doing something she'll hate herself for if she ever becomes lucid enough to remember it. Whether you meant to or not, you're part of her story now." When Alan disappeared behind the trees, Ethan remained where he stood, Ember's heartbeat small but steady against his palm. He looked toward the deeper woods where Lily had vanished. There was a pull in his chest, subtle, unsettling, something that felt less like duty and more like recognition. Broken calls to broken. Ember nuzzled him again, as if urging him forward. Ethan tightened his hold on the pup, knowing instinctively that the road ahead would tangle him deeper into Lily's unraveling world. And somewhere beyond the fog, Lily Breen moved alone, tethered still to the memory that had shattered her. As Ethan resumed walking toward town, he couldn't shake the chilling certainty that the next time their paths crossed, it would not be by accident. Snow weakened into a thin mist as evening settled over the forest, turning the world into a soft blur of gray and silver. Ethan Cole moved through the narrow trail behind his cabin, with Ember trotting close to his boots. Though the pup was still fragile, his steps had grown steadier, his small body warmed by rest and care. The forest was quiet in a way that felt deceptive, like something had drawn breath and was holding it, waiting. Ethan had not intended to wander far, only to let Ember stretch his legs and clear his own thoughts after the conversation with Deputy Allen. But the woods had a way of guiding people into deeper corners of themselves. He followed the path almost without deciding to, letting instinct navigate where the mind felt too heavy. Ember sniffed the ground and paused frequently, ears twitching with every distant creak of branches. Even in his weakened state, the pup was alert, receptive to shifts in the air that humans rarely noticed. Ethan found himself watching Ember the way he once watched Ranger, finding in the small creature's movements the same quiet courage that had steadied him through far worse places than this forest. The sky darkened gradually until only streaks of faint gold clung to the horizon. Ethan turned toward home, but Ember suddenly froze. His body stiffened, head lifted, eyes locked toward the deeper woods. The sound reached Ethan a beat later, a faint, unnatural popping echo carried by the wind. He frowned. Snow doesn't make sounds like that. Ember let out a tiny bark, then another. Ethan crouched down. "What is it, boy?" The pup took a hesitant step forward, then looked back at Ethan, tail stiff, urging. Ethan's pulse picked up. He felt it too now, an acrid scent threading through the cold air. Smoke. Not the familiar wood smoke from cabins. This was sharper, more frantic, something burning out of control. Ember barked again, louder this time, and broke into a wobbling run toward the source. "Ember, slow down!" Ethan followed, his boots cutting through the snow as adrenaline surged through him. The forest thickened as they moved, branches knitting overhead like ribs around a beating heart. Then, through the trees, a dim orange flicker pulsed against the gray sky. Flames. Ember reached the clearing first and halted abruptly, trembling. Ethan stepped beside him and saw the small wooden structure ahead, Lily Breen's home. Fire crawled along the outer wall like hungry fingers, licking upward, devouring dry wood with frightening speed. The windows glowed red from inside, shadows thrashing against the flames. There was no sound except crackling and the frantic pop of burning timber, no movement from the woman who lived there. Ethan's stomach dropped. Lily might be inside. Ember whimpered, pacing anxiously at his feet. Ethan scanned the area quickly. No footprints leading away, no sign she had escaped. He didn't hesitate. Training left no room for hesitation. "Stay back," he told. "Ember," but the words came out thin and hollow, carried off by the rising heat. He sprinted toward the burning door, feeling the temperature spike immediately. The door handle was molten hot to the touch, forcing him to shield his arm with his coat as he rammed his shoulder into it. The weakened hinges snapped inward, releasing a rush of smoke that stung his lungs. Ethan dropped low, crawling into the haze that swallowed the interior. Flames crawled across the ceiling beams, spitting sparks and raining embers like burning snow. "Lily!" he shouted, voice muffled by smoke. He listened, but the cabin answered with only collapsing wood and the roar of fire. He pressed forward, sweeping his arm across the floor until something brushed his fingers. Fabric? A sleeve? He pulled, revealing Lily curled into herself near the corner, arms shielding her head as if trying to hide from a world too loud to bear. Her breaths were shallow, each one a weak gasp against the smoke. "Lily, you need to move," he said sharply, lifting her under the arms. She stirred faintly, eyes barely open. Ethan dragged her toward the door. A flaming beam cracked overhead and crashed to the floor, sparks exploding across the room. Ethan shielded Lily with his body and pushed forward with a surge of force he hadn't felt since deployment. His lungs burned, vision blurred, but he kept moving until the cold slapped him across the face as he burst through the doorway. Ember barked wildly, circling them as Ethan lowered Lily into the snow. She coughed violently, then curled into him instinctively, trembling. The fire roared behind them, consuming the roof in great waves of orange. Ethan held her upright. "Lily, can you hear me?" Her voice emerged small, cracked. I heard Jonah." Ethan's chest tightened. Ember stepped close, nudging her hand softly. Lily flinched at first, but the pup simply sat beside her, offering warmth. Something in her expression faltered, fear loosening, grief rising to the surface. She whispered, "He tried to save the dog, not run from it." Ethan didn't know whether she was remembering truth or inventing mercy to soothe her grief, but he saw clarity flicker through her eyes like a trembling candle. Lily sagged forward, exhausted, and Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders to steady her. Ember pressed against her other side. The three of them sat in the snow as Lily's burning house collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. For the first time since the accident that shattered her life, Lily did not scream, did not run, did not lash out. She simply breathed, raw, broken, but alive. Ethan watched the flames rise higher, knowing this moment was only the beginning. Something had opened in Lily tonight, not fully, not safely, but undeniably. Ember had sensed danger before any human ear could hear it. And now Lily, unconscious or not, leaned gently toward him as if tethered to a truth she had long rejected. Not all dogs bring loss. Some bring you back from it. Morning light rose gently over the charred clearing where Lily Breen's house had stood, washing the forest in pale gold. Frost clung to the branches, and the snow around the ruins had melted into uneven patches where the heat had struck hardest. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the smoldering remains, Ember pressed against his boot, the small pup watching the ash field with quiet awareness. The night had stretched longer than usual, filled with smoke, the echo of flames, and the fragile breaths of a woman who had spent months lost inside her grief. Lily now rested inside a temporary shelter offered by the community clinic in town, monitored closely after her collapse. Ethan had carried her there himself, Ember trailing behind with a mix of exhaustion and vigilance that felt too old for such a small creature. As Ethan surveyed the ruin, he wasn't thinking about what was lost. He was thinking about what had almost been. The fire might have consumed Lily if Ember hadn't heard it. The truth lingered in his thoughts with a quiet gravity. He hadn't just saved Lily. Ember had saved her too. Ethan inhaled the cold air, letting it settle the remnants of fear that remained in his chest. He turned away from the ruin as Deputy Alan Pierce approached, boots crunching softly. Alan looked tired but grounded, a man accustomed to carrying burdens that weren't necessarily his own. He paused beside Ethan. "Fire investigators came this morning," Alan said. "Faulty wiring. Old houses are vulnerable this time of year." Ethan nodded. "Lily didn't start it?" "No," Alan answered. "She isn't to blame for that. She's been running from enough shadows. She doesn't need another." They stood in silence until Alan added, "She keeps asking for you. Mixed up between moments, but yours is the name that comes through." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Some part of him understood why. He had stepped into the darkest chapter of her life, and not by choice, but some choices weren't choices at all. They happened because the world demanded someone show up. Ethan stroked Ember's head. "I'll visit her." Later that afternoon, he entered the clinic, a modest building warmed by soft lighting and the gentle hum of space heaters fighting the winter air. Lily sat near a window, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her gaze drifted slowly over the snow outside. She looked aware, but fragile in a way that made her seem caught between two worlds. A nurse named Delia Hart hovered nearby. She introduced herself quietly to Ethan, explaining she had worked there for many years. Delia carried a calm presence shaped by long nights, tending to the elderly and the mentally distressed. Her firm yet patient approach had saved more than one lost soul during her career. She retreated to give him space as Ethan approached Lily. Ember followed, hesitant but willing. Lily turned her head at the sound of their footsteps. Her expression shifted, fear first, then memory, then a slow, trembling recognition. "You came back," she whispered. Ethan lowered himself into the chair beside her. "I wanted to see how you're doing." Her gaze fell to Ember, who cautiously approached her leg. Instead of recoiling, Lily extended a shaky hand. Ember nuzzled it softly. Tears welled instantly in Lily's eyes. "I thought dogs took everything from me," she said. Her voice trembled, yet she didn't pull away. "But he didn't. He saved me, and I tried to hurt him." Her words broke on the edges of guilt and clarity. Ethan rested his hand on the arm of her chair. "You were hurting. Grief twists the world into something sharp. It lies, and when you're alone, the lies feel real." Lily closed her eyes. Jonah loved dogs. He wasn't running from one that day. He was chasing it because he trusted it. I kept seeing it wrong. I blamed the wrong thing. The clarity in her voice was faint, but it was real. Healing wasn't a single moment. It was a string of moments like this one, where truth was allowed to breathe. Delia returned briefly to check Lily's pulse, then leaned toward Ethan. "She's stabilizing. She'll need long-term care, but she's reachable. That matters more than anything." When Ethan and Ember stepped outside later, the cold air felt less punishing. Snow drifted lazily, soft flakes landing on Ember's nose. The pup sneezed, and Ethan almost laughed at the small reminder that life still moved, still unfolded, in surprising ways. Word spread quickly through Havenport about what had happened. Some residents felt sympathy for Lily. Others felt fear. Small towns survived on shared understanding, and Ethan sensed the need for something that could reshape the narrative, something that could repair the town's fractured view of tragedy and recovery. A week later, he found himself standing outside a vacant storage shed near the edge of town, once used for fishing supplies, but now empty. Martha Green joined him, her calm steps crunching lightly across the snow. "You want to turn this into something?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "A place for people to bring wounded animals, and for people like Lily who need to mend in quieter ways." Martha smiled softly. "Second Chance Haven," she said, tasting the name slowly. "It fits." Alan arrived soon after, and then Delia. By evening, volunteers gathered. Someone brought paint, someone else tools. The shed transformed gradually into a warm space, small but inviting. Embers of kindness spreading through a town that hadn't realized how much it needed warmth. Lily was transferred there weeks later, not fully healed, but no longer lost. She helped fold blankets, water bowls, simple tasks that grounded her in the present. Every time Ember entered the room, she seemed to breathe easier. Ethan visited often, offering help where needed. He felt the scar tissue inside him, old grief, old failures, shift in small ways he could not deny. One afternoon, as sun filtered through the shed windows, Lily approached him with Ember trotting between them. "I want to thank you," she said quietly. "Not for saving me from the fire, but for saving me from the story I kept telling myself." Ethan met her gaze. "We all tell the wrong story sometimes. What matters is rewriting it." Ember lay down at their feet, tail tapping faintly, as if agreeing. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Havenport began to weave the threads of the three lives together. People who once whispered now greeted Lily warmly. Ethan, once a stranger, became someone they sought for guidance. Ember grew into a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the smallest lives sometimes carried the greatest strength. And on a quiet morning beneath the fading winter sky, Ethan finally allowed himself to believe something he had long resisted. Broken things did not have to stay broken. Not people, not memories, not lives. The world did not heal in grand gestures, but in moments like this, one breath, one step, one second chance at a time. In the quiet corners of our lives where grief settles like winter frost and hope feels too fragile to touch, God often sends His miracles in forms we don't expect. not in thunder, not in lightning, but in small footsteps, soft breaths, and moments that pull us back from the edge. Sometimes that miracle is a frightened puppy who refuses to give up. Sometimes it is a broken woman who finds her way back through the kindness of strangers. And sometimes it is a weary soldier, learning that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from letting God place new light where old shadows once lived. Just like Ethan, Lily, and Ember, we all carry scars the world cannot see. We all walk through fires, some inside, some outside, and wonder if anyone notices our trembling. But the truth is simple and eternal. God never leaves His children in the dark. He guides us toward second chances, toward people who lift us when we stumble, toward love that finds us even when we are lost. If you are watching this today, remember, you are not forgotten, you are not alone. And no matter how deep the night feels, God is already shaping your sunrise. So share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Leave a comment to tell others where God has touched your life. Hit subscribe so you never miss another story of hope, redemption, and the quiet miracles that walk beside us every day. And tonight, before you sleep, whisper a prayer for the lost, the weary, the broken, and for those who still choose kindness when the world feels cold. May God bless you, keep you, and fill your home with the gentle miracle of His light. Amen.